If there's one thing we can say for absolute certainty, that we know for it to be an absolute fact, uh, an a priori belief, something that we know can't be assailed, is the idea that appeasement in the political world doesn't work. It's absolutely an unassailable idea, cannot be challenged in any way. You don't even need to think about it. You don't need to back up any assertion you make regarding appeasement. Just saying the word appeasement proves that appeasement doesn't work. By the way, bonus points for anybody who might be familiar with this frame other than me and my son. In fact, if you try researching appeasement, you'll be convinced that no one had ever even thought of the idea before the 1930s. It's never been tried before. And then European fools suddenly, this appeasement idea popped into their heads, and boom, they tried it, and it failed miserably. And maybe they tried a little bit with Italy, and it still failed miserably. And that's the absolute end of that story, because there's just nothing that can be learned about appeasement. So, what is appeasement really? Okay, appeasement is when two powers recognize they have a grievance, and they come up with a methodology to settle their grievance without a war, without loss of life. Now, one of the biggest wars that break out in Europe is known as the 30 Years' War that breaks out into the 1600s. What makes it an interesting war is that it is borderline like a world war because all the European powers get involved at various locations. It can't really be called a world war because it doesn't really leave Europe, but it's one of the first wars that basically engulfs all of it. And it ends up starting due to a breakdown in the containment of Protestantism and Catholicism. Uh, Earlier, they'd assigned Catholicism and Protestantism kind of spheres within Europe. And once they started moving out of those spheres, it essentially created conflict. Now, prior to this, the concept of appeasement had been used a lot. It basically prevented this particular war from breaking out for quite a long period. Appeasement keeps wars down to very small single state conflicts rather than continental or world conflagrations. Now, appeasement breaks down the next time into what's known as the 7-Year War or the French and Indian War. Primarily, this happens due to murky boundaries in North America and an inability to come up with a plan that actually works for everyone. Now, after the 7 Years' War, continental wars would be put on hold until 1800, and that's when Great Britain and the monarchies of Europe refused to negotiate with Napoleon. Appeasement following the Napoleonic Wars would then keep wars down to single regions for the next 100 years again. No world war breaking out because of it. And appeasement is used heavily throughout the 1800s. Definitely reducing the amount of wars that occur. Now, appeasement, for the most part, ends up being a practice of very large powers intimidating small powers. Very large powers agreeing to carve up small powers. Very large powers trading land on frontiers involving ethnic minorities. Now, I'm not saying appeasement is the greatest thing that ever happened because it's always at the disadvantage of the small, be it a small country, a small region, a small ethnic group. And yeah, it's no fun when you're on the receiving end of a deal that's an appeasement. But if the result is no war, and the result is a long time period of no war, um, it's a coin toss as to how how bad things turned out, depending on which side of it you're on. Now, World War I breaks out on the premise that peace could only be achieved by the total defeat of the other great powers. And certain elements of history came together to make appeasement unfunctional for a while. Russia's policy of pan Slavic subversion of the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire's deterioration created a situation of massive instability. The Franco Prussian War of the late 1800s had convinced both France and Germany that one big final war was inevitable and that one or the other needed to be reduced significantly in order for there to be stability. Essentially, all the powers were looking at the idea that there needed to be one big war to create a lasting peace. Well, they certainly got the one big war, the lasting peace, not so much. Now, a critical item that gets overlooked from American viewpoints of history because we look at things in an American centric sort of way, or worse, we get our history from British historians who are basically giving their spin uh, from an establishmentarian point of view. The British have always, at least probably, well, we'll see how it plays out with the current wars in play, but the British practice was always to try to balance the continent. Their goal was to try to create two to three major powers on the continent that none of them would be capable of completely dominating the other, and that they would tend to have standoffs or skirmishes on their borders rather than it turning into a large war. As long as there wasn't a large war, England didn't need to worry about the continent and they could happily go trading on the high seas. Now, British balanced the continent several times in major peace conferences. Probably the most notorious one would be the post Napoleonic War Peace Conference, where they got the biggest input in deciding where the boundary lines of things would lie. Ironically, one of the things they did was create a large German power in the middle of Central Europe in order to be a balance against future French aggression, ultimately creating the next enemy they would have to deal with. Not intentionally, by the way. Uh, they were just looking at what they could do for the term they were dealing with. However, once the Franco Prussian War occurred, the British saw what they believed to be imbalance. The Prussians had taken Alsace-Lorraine. That was considered bad cricket, so to speak. And the Brits saw the French as being the underdog, and it created a situation where the British created secret agreements with the British. Excuse me, the British created secret agreements with the French, promising to come in on their side should a war break out. Now, once World War I was over, the Brits weren't at quite as much in the driver's seat in the setup of the post World War One European boundary lines. We have a city in our state that's Versailles, but they pronounce it Versailles, and it always messes me up. Versailles was created in many small countries that were unstable and fragile. There were hopes that the new countries of the Little Entente, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia, coupled with Poland and France, would create a bulwark against future German aggression. Now, this isn't what the British thought would happen. This is what the French hoped would happen. And essentially, most of these new countries were really not terribly stable. So they weren't that menacing to the potential of a future rising Germany. Now, the big problem with this particular security setup was that Czechoslovakia and France saw Germany as the greatest threat, whereas Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia saw Russia as the greater threat. The British establishment concluded that the greatest threat to Europe was Russia, and they came to the conclusion that France and the Little Entente were incapable of stopping Russia. France had been unable to stop Germany on its own in the last conflict, and the horrible casualties, nearly 10% of their military age population died in the war. And it scarred the French psyche to the point where they had an incredibly defeatist attitude. The British establishment decided to back a German resurgence to create balance in Europe by creating a power that they believed could prevent Russian expansion. If you want to get a view on the British establishment, French establishment, and the German establishment during this time period, it's worth checking out Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. It's essentially a history of establishments. Now, the British felt bad for how they had treated Germany. And you have to know that the Brits have always been very sentimental and very caring and soft-hearted and very, prone to fits of emotion and not really worried about, realpolitik. They're really tend to think of things in terms of how it makes them feel. No. And it's hilarious for people who basically try to run this. If you look at the British politics of that era, the British didn't feel, and I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the establishment and the decision makers. They felt no great sense of wrong or remorse for anything the British Empire did on the planet. They didn't need to make redress for anything. So ultimately, I mean, for the most part, the world was blaming Germany for World War I. Why would the British establishment suddenly feel sorry for them? Well, the answer is they didn't. Because appeasement was just a smokescreen for the reality. And the reality was that the British desperately wanted to rebalance the continent again. Every government of Germany, from the end of World War I, including the earliest Weimar government, violated Part 5 of the Versailles Treaty. This was the section that limited the size and composition of the German military. Everyone was aware of these violations. France constantly protested. Up through 1930, France alone, without help, could have marched into Germany and demanded compliance. Britain made it clear it would not back France in enforcing compliance. 1923 to 1925, the French came in and occupied the Ruhr, which is an industrial region of Germany. The reason they came in is because the Germans were refusing to make their reparations payments. The British did not back the French in their endeavor to get the payments back on schedule. Not only did Britain not push to keep reparations at Versailles levels, the British pushed for a compromise plan on reparations and for the quickest removal of French troops from Germany. The plan benefited German heavy industry over the French due to French dependence on German coal. Part of the reparations was slated in actually shipping tons of coal across the border. The effect was that French industry was able to run at full tilt, and German industry was almost incapable of running. By altering reparations to where the Germans didn't have to give out their coal, French industry now suffered. Their military output dropped. German military output surged because their factories were now online. And this was something that was plain for everybody to see. It wasn't like everyone was going, oh, we don't have any idea what's going on. When the factory is spewing out war material, it's pretty easy for anybody wandering the countryside to be able to see what's going on. In 1929-1930 time frame, we have the initiation of the Young Plan. The Young Plan came out of the United States, presumably with British acceptance. At that point, the United States wasn't at its peak of arrogance where it would be wandering around doing things on the continent without British approval. The Young Plan reduced further payments by 20%. Although the theoretical was 112 billion gold marks, a rough equivalent to 27 billion US dollars, this amount was to be paid over a period of 58 years, which would have meant that the agreement would end in the year 1988. Part of the agreement required France to pull out of the Rhineland, which was another area of Germany they were occupying. The British wholeheartedly backed this plan. February of 1932, the World Disarmament Conference opened in Geneva, and the idea was actually to try to reduce offensive weapons of war to make it impossible for countries to fight wars. At least, make it impossible to do so. Among the hotly debated issues at the conference was the German demand for Gleichberechtigung, equality. They wanted to abolish Part 5 of the Versailles Treaty, and they were opposed to a French demand of security. They wanted to maintain Part 5, and they wanted to have more armaments than the Germans. The British attempted to play honest broker and sought to seek a compromise between the French claim to security and the German claim to, I'm not doing that again, equality, which in practice meant backing the German claim to rearm beyond Part 5, but not allowing the Germans to rearm enough to threaten the French. Several of the British compromise proposals along these lines were rejected by both the French and German delegations as unacceptable. The 1934 Disarmament Conference broke down with France declaring that it would tend to its own security needs. Now here's where it gets kind of fun, because the French historians claim that German offers that were made were specifically designed to meet with British approval, but not France's. So they were saying that the Germans were not arguing or not negotiating in good faith, that they knew what the British would accept, and they also knew what the French would not. So by doing these proposals, Germany would theoretically make themselves look good to the world stage, because Britain was saying, well, yeah, that seems reasonable, and French would look unreasonable because they were constantly saying, well, no. Now, This is pretty goofy because Germany, at least in that time frame, is not known for clever diplomacy. In fact, they've always been depicted as being kind of brutish and ham-handed when it comes to diplomacy. How would Germany carefully find out what France would not accept, but Britain would? Were the British giving away their negotiating position to the Germans? Or was it the French were actually unwilling to compromise? Nonetheless, it shows that there was a tilt by the British to the Germans and away from France. They were more interested in building up the Germans, because clearly the French weren't a threat to the Germans because the French weren't planning on invading. Why would the British want the Germans to have greater armaments? Because they're trying to make it a great power to balance the continent again. In 1936 was the Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Essentially, the numbers were brought forth by the Germans, and the British ultimately ended up agreeing to them. The idea was that the Germans could build 35% of whatever the British Navy had, and that's by class and tonnage. The agreement was concluded entirely in secret and unveiled to a very angry France. The standard line of the Brits was they hoped to achieve by negotiating what they were unwilling to do with real-world force. The fact that the Germans initiated the agreement showed that they believed the British could stop them. There was no reason to suspect that the Germans had the ability to roll over the French in 6 weeks at that point. Any war would have been a long, slogging affair. So one would assume that the Brits, believing that the next war would probably look a lot like the last war, had no reason to fear going to war with Germany. The agreement was ultimately signed in 25 March. And what makes that date interesting is the Germans had begun their reoccupation of the demilitarized Rhineland 3 weeks earlier. So that kind of shows that, okay, either all these events are occurring completely unrelated, or all of them seem to continuously be moving forward to building a stronger Germany. As noted by Quigley, again in Tragedy and Hope, the British establishment was committed to a rearmed Germany. They accepted the merger of Austria into Germany, despite it being yet one more thing prohibited by the Versailles Treaty. Now, one of the things that people get all messed up about, and this is a frequent problem, is they will look at what is going on in diplomatic chatter. And they will think, oh, well, this is what these countries are saying out loud, so we are hearing them talk to the other side. And diplomatic chatter doesn't work that way. When a country wants to get a message across to another country, they don't make a story in a newspaper. They don't get on the radio and speak in their own language. They get diplomats to talk in the other person's language so that they are very clear on what they're doing. Overwhelmingly, the stuff that ends up in newspapers and ends up in speeches that are the speeches that are given to the people of the country, all that is entirely for the consumption of that country. It's not the actual diplomatic chatter that's going on. So, yes, you will find things in the overt historical narrative that'll say, well, yeah, what they're saying is contrary to this, because that's not what they wanted the people to hear. They weren't going to, the British establishment wasn't going to tell the British people, hey, we're making Germany really big and massive again, and we're going to let it arm to the teeth because we know what we're doing, and we need to block the Soviet Union. That would have been too hard to explain. It's much easier to sit there and go, oh, well, yeah, we really feel bad about Germany. Oh, yeah, we feel so remorseful. We feel so bad. And so, just as one more time, we'll give them what they want. But, we really protested. We protested a lot. And we made sure that they understood that, this might be the last time we do this. And, we don't want to be, dealing with the whole, war thing again. No, that's not what was happening. It was very clearly something that was being worked on uh, in a linear planned fashion. Now, the Brits envisioned a greater Germany with the German areas reincorporated back into Germany, essentially ethnic German areas outside. Uh, they envisioned seeing an international corridor to East Prussia. They also envisioned seeing Poland and Czechoslovakia as independent countries that were all completely subservient satellite states of Germany. They believed this would give Germany the industry and the land depth to basically be a thwart to the USSR and bring greater parity to Europe. At least something that would make the Soviets think twice about going in there if they're up against a united front of Germany with Poland and Czechoslovakia's population and assets as part of the war chest. The goal of balancing the continent would allow Great Britain to postpone having to enter another world war. The really big problem, though, and by the way, just to clarify, especially with Czechoslovakia, when the Sudetenland was given away, there was a lot more going on than just the Germans who lived there. That region was a combination of natural barriers and fortifications. Its removal made Czechoslovakia militarily impotent. It guaranteed that at the very least, the Czechs would have very little chance, with the exception of basically bowing to Germany's needs. The British very well knew this and accepted it. They knew this was going to be the outcome, and they were okay with it. Ultimately, the big problem is that the British establishment was ignoring Mein Kampf. The leader of socialist Germany was very clear that his goal was not to stop the USSR from entering Europe, but to seize the Soviet grain in Ukraine and Soviet oil in the Caucasus. The German socialist government was on a tight timetable because of their economy. Due to socialism, they could not wait for years to build a large defensive military that the British had envisioned. The German socialist government had an economy that was teetering on collapse at almost every given turn. And from their mindset, they had to act fast in order to fulfill their goals of heading east. Ultimately, it was the British establishment that deliberately not only allowed, but helped engineer the military buildup of socialist Germany. The German socialists were not emboldened by British appeasement. They were partners in it. If presented a roadblock, it's likely socialist Germany would have followed very similar steps. Their economy was always going to hit a point where it was going to hit a brick wall and get ready to implode, and they were always going to believe that the only route to salvation for making their form of socialism work was incorporating Ukraine and Caucasus into their sphere. Appeasement doesn't always fail. It worked great for hundreds of years. In this case, appeasement was a cloak to hide the British Empire's establishment goal of deliberately enabling and creating Greater Germany. German socialism always viewed their program as an all-or-nothing affair. There wasn't any point they believed they could stop, halt, or delay. They always had to move their timetable at the fastest pace possible before their economy imploded. They believed the only way their economy would work is once all the resources were available for their use. So, has anyone read Quigley's Tragedy and Hope? Comment below. Have you heard this version of events in terms of appeasement in the British establishment before? What's your opinion on it? Please comment. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm has brought you here and you're not one of my regular subscribers, please consider subscribing. I have a very eclectic grouping of topics that I go over. And if you think somebody might find this interesting, please consider sharing it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.